In order to understand the Romantic movement, we have to look a little bit at the history that surrounds the Romantic movement. All history is a conversation, essentially. And if we see it as a conversation, it's a lot easier to understand what's going on, instead of seeing it as just one thing after another. For us, the Romantic movement is a conversation between the poets and artists of the 19th century and the poets and artists and thinkers of the 18th century. Most of what happens in the Romantic movement is a response to what happens in the Enlightenment movement. In order to understand the one, we have to some degree, look at the other. The name Romantic actually is nothing or very little to do with what we consider to be romance nowadays. The Romantic movement looked back in time to an era of art and poetry and government that they considered to be noble, virtuous, honorable, and that time period was the Roman period. So looking back to those poets, the poets of the Augustan age, the form, the structure that they employed, that's what the Romantic poets tried to bring to their own craft, to their own poetry. Consequently, they termed themselves the Romantic poets, as hearkening back to that era of Roman culture. Very little to do with romance as what we conceive, but everything to do with the fact that they were basing themselves on an earlier culture they considered to be very noble. So first, the Enlightenment movement. The Enlightenment movement emerged essentially out of the violence and the terror and the civil wars that happened in the 17th century. And that actually emerged out of the development of the printing press. The printing press, developed in the 1500s, allowed for the printing of texts on a very large-scale basis. Before this, presses didn't exist, and people got their books by hand writing out a book on animal skin. And so they're very expensive, and only the wealthy had access to such books because they were so expensive. The printing press and the advent of very cheap paper allowed, for the first time, printing to be cheap and available to the ordinary man. And this then caused an upheaval in European society because people having access to books suddenly began questioning things about how the governments were run, how the church was run. And it caused an upheaval then that led to tremendous bloodshed in the 1600s. And that bloodshed was so fierce that the men, the intellectuals that came afterwards said, if that's where the whole old regime leads us to, we have to have a new way of doing things. And so emerged the Enlightenment movement. And the Enlightenment movement was in the 1700s. A group of men who sought a better way of doing things and sought to undermine the ancient regime, the old way of doing things, the old regime, in order to supplant it with a new form of government and a new way of thinking about themselves. The Enlightenment essentially stressed reason as the dominant force for controlling human life. We govern ourselves primarily by reason. They suggested also that man was primarily a machine within a machine. This world was a machine, and we are machines within that machine. Once we use reason to understand how that machine works, we can create good societies, we can create good education, we can train people to be happier, to be able to make their world more comfortable, and to design governments that work very, very well. A lot of great things come out of this. Most of the technology that we have comes out of this. Most of the governments that we now enjoy in the Western world, democracy, republican governments, these actually emerge out of the Enlightenment movement. For instance, in our own government, we hold that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That whole sentiment is an Enlightenment sentiment. The Enlightenment also held that education was crucial to basically making good citizens. And so everybody had to be educated upon certain principles that would allow them to become good citizens. Unfortunately, with the Enlightenment, however, you also have a dark side. And the dark side is that it leads to machine-like living and a loss of the vision of the greatness of life and human beings who become part of those machines that they created. And thus the Industrial Revolution and the violence of the end of the French Revolution, for instance, in the late 1780s, those sorts of things were very negative. The violence, the being part of a machine. And it was to that the Romantics began to speak. The men and the artists of the Romantic movement at first hailed things like the French Revolution and the American Revolution as great, as a liberation from the shackles that held us down. But as it became clear that the French Revolution was leading to further and further levels of violence, and as it became clear that the dark satanic mills that had been created from the minds of people thinking machine, became clear that humans were being reduced to a very subservient level. The Romantics said, this can't be how we live. And they began to stress, instead of reason, creativity, imagination, intense emotion. They began to stress, instead of formalized education, an education of what we love. And they began to stress not just the idea of man as a machine, but as man as part of a much greater, more beautiful thing than simply mechanized living. That, in essence, is the Romantic movement. Man is a great creature who's evolved in a great, majestic business, and it's his imagination, not his reason, that will be his salvation.